Hey, everybody. Welcome to the breakdown and welcome to Heather Cox Richardson, who writes Letters from an American. It's so good to talk to you, my friend. I know that we caught up a little bit on our panel earlier, or maybe it was late last week. Time has no meaning to me
I
anymore,
know.
Heather.
Yeah, I know.
um, but I'm so glad that you're here because I really wanted to talk to you about your last couple of posts on Letters from an American. And I wanted to open this conversation we're going to have today um, just to talk about democracy and authoritarianism in general, but this specifically the takeover of DC and how this administration privatizes things to break them or takes them over to break them so that they can show there are problems with the government in order to move forward with their authoritarian agenda. And you talked about several different things going on in DC that have a lot of nuance. That, I mean, yes, there are armed military on the streets in DC, but it goes deeper than that. It goes all the way into, ripping out the budget and taking over Union Station and things like that. And I was hoping you could go into a little bit of a detail as you did in your live podcast that you did on Substack. I encourage everyone to listen to it. It was a couple of days ago about that sort of process and who you think is in charge of it, because I don't know that it's necessarily Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think that's right. And first of all, it's a real pleasure to be here with you. And for those of you who were expecting us earlier, it was my bad, not Allison's, that made us late. I live where there is very little cell connection, and we had an error with it, so I had to move around. I think it's important to recognize that this is not necessarily Donald Trump in charge. As we know, he is falling apart both physically and mentally. And it seems to me that there are a number of actors who are trying to put in place a system that will continue to increase its authoritarianism, regardless of who is in power. And the key actors in that appear to be Russell Vogt as the director of the Office of Management and Budget, who was a key author of Project 2025 and has been responsible for a lot of the pieces of the government that have been slashing through civil servants, for example. And the other person is White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller, who we know is behind the draconian immigration policies, among other things. So I think they're trying to put in place a system that will go of its own, if you will. And one of the pieces to that, I think, is demonstrating through space, if you will, through the control of space, that the federal government appears, and I say that very concertedly, appears to be in charge of the federal government. And this is the idea behind putting the National Guard troops into Washington and mobilizing different troops into Washington. But it's also behind, I think, the takeover of key transportation nodes. So Union Station, for example, where veterans have been protesting, is the Amtrak station in Washington, D.C., and the metro station for that area, which means that the federal troops, if in fact this goes through, will control that space. And similarly, there's been talk of taking over South Station in Boston. And it's crucial to remember that the Amtrak station in Washington and South Station in Boston are key ends, the two ends of the Eastern Corridor, which is the most trafficked portion of Amtrak in the country. I put such an emphasis there on South Station because Boston also has North Station that nobody is talking about taking over. And North Station does for Maine, New Hampshire, those states, the same thing that South Station does for the rest of the country. And they clearly have much less interest in taking over North Station than they do taking over South Station. So a lot of this, I think, is designed to demonstrate that they control the seat of the federal government, even though they are enormously unpopular. And looking forward to that, I think the administration has lost any right to any of us assuming that they are up to anything good. And one of the things that I worry about looking forward is that it certainly seems as if everybody expects that in a free and fair vote, the 2026 election would go heavily for the Democrats. You can see how at a national level, the Republicans are trying to redistrict the states, trying to suppress voting, and so on and so forth. But there's also the issue if the federal troops control Washington, D.C., under Trump. And it's not clear that the federal troops, especially the National Guard troops, want to be there and want to be doing this. But if they are, and if they are ordered out, what's to stop the Republicans from simply refusing to recognize the election of Democratic colleagues, saying this is voter fraud and we're not going to be part of that? I think it's time to look at all of this as something more than, oh, he can't possibly be doing that, and as, oh, he is doing that, and how are we going to stand against it?
Yeah, and I think that that's sort of kind of what the tack that Governor Gavin Newsom is taking. I've heard JB Pritzker talk about this. We hear Wes Moore, Kathy Hochul. I'm not sure she can do anything till 2028, but still, as far as redistricting goes. But when it comes to the messaging that we're getting, not just from elected leadership, but from corporate media, who just seems to move forward as if this were a normal situation, a normal, like a 2012 political situation. What are your thoughts on that, and how we push back against that? I mean, I constantly talk to my electeds and say, this is should be a wake up call. But I think what the kinds of things that you and I are doing right at this minute are what we do to push back against the corporate media's normalization of it.
There is that. I will say one of the things that I'm watching really closely, and by the way, I'm sorry I'm shaking. I don't have my stand or anything up here. Um, One of the things that I'm watching very closely is it certainly seems to me like an awful lot of people are hedging their bets. And by that I mean I think it certainly seems clear to a lot of people that Donald Trump appears to be in the position of moving off stage, which will put JD Vance on stage. And because of that, it is not clear, first of all, whether or not the MAGA movement will stand behind JD Vance, who is utterly charmless and not good politically at all. And it also makes it unclear which way will be the best way to jump, the most advantageous way to jump. So for the corporate media, for example, you're seeing, I think, a real attempt to hedge bets. That is, for example, we have CBS canceling Stephen Colbert, but not getting rid of him tomorrow. He's got 10 months to cause as much trouble to the administration as he can. And similarly, if you think about the number of media outlets that seem to have kowtowed to Trump, they are also running really hard hitting pieces against the Trump administration by certain authors. So I think what you're seeing with a lot of people, and I think we could do this with a lot of companies as well, certainly with universities and law firms, they're trying to kick the can down the road. The issue is this can can't be kicked any further. It is time. We're looking at a shutdown now in the fall over the administration's attempt to take utter control over domestic spending in the United States, which is absolutely illegal and unconstitutional. All these things are coming to really the place where the rubber has to meet the road. Now, one of the things I think that you and I are doing, and people like us are doing, is we are, in a sense, an old fashioned new wave of media. That is, we are not corporately driven. You can see our studios are perhaps not quite as good as other people's. But what we do, I think, is mimic the best of old media that is in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, 1890s, 1920s. The way that media really operated was that people got an idea that they felt was important and they started to see if people wanted to learn about it. And it turns out they really did then and they really do now. And what that did was it created a new way to think about the United States. And now you think about the way that we are seeing stories covered. There was just one I saw today that I thought was fascinating, and I could be wrong, but I think it was in the Washington Post. It was an exclusive about how Tesla appeared to have lost a crucial film when an allegedly self-driving car drove into two pedestrians, killed one of them, and gravely injured another. And they said, "Oh, well, we've lost the film." Well, a hacker found the film and was able to insert that into evidence in the trial against Tesla, and there was a huge settlement against Tesla. And the reason I mention that is because I think one of the things media is doing now, pushed in part by people like you, less by me. You're an investigative journalist and I'm not. But they're forcing the rest of the world to catch up and do those stories because they sell. People are interested in that. And the reason I mentioned that Tesla story is because to me, it screamed out the muckrakers of the late 19th century, where people were really interested in how the concentration of wealth and power were affecting their lives on a personal level. It wasn't just philosophical, oh, JD Rockefeller shouldn't get everything. It was, holy crap, they're making it so I can't have a living wage and I'm going to die from the pollution in the streets. And I feel like we are seeing that not only with people like you and me, but also the mainstream or legacy media is having to keep up with that. And a lot of them are doing a really good job. You got Mother Jones, you got ProPublica, you've got, and then you also have some of the writers in places like the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the even the LA Times.
Yeah, ProPublica is doing some amazing work. You're right, Mother Jones. The way that I kind of curate my own news feed is sort of like how I watch baseball. I'm not so much into the teams as I am into the players, and like
Yeah, exactly.
I really liked certain players and would follow them and their careers no matter which team they were on. Sort of like fantasy uh, football, but for the media. And I think that there's a real opportunity for a partnership there. We saw this happen with the big major record labels in the 90s. The independent artists wanted to kind of do their own thing and they wanted to work with the record labels because they had the distribution and the ability to get on the radio. But they weren't really listening to the artists. And so eventually those major labels went the way of the dodo. And I think I really want to be able to partner what we do with corporate media, but I don't know if they think that there's room for us. Um, let's go back a little bit to the DC issue because you mentioned the trains and taking over in Boston at the both ends of the line. What is the purpose of that? I think you mentioned briefly it's to show that you're taking over the transportation to the national capital region. Is that it? Or I mean, I historically I'm thinking about seizing the means of production and rails. It's just kind of there in the back of my mind. What do you think that is particularly about?
Well, seizing the means of production is interesting with this administration because they are, in fact, doing that with things like the 10% clawback or takeover of Intel, and with a number of other corporations that they've done the same thing. But I actually think, in terms of the rail lines, it's less the companies than the physical places of those stations. And, that I think demonstrates power, but I also think it will make it harder for people to come into the cities to protest. And one of the things the administration is desperate to do is to try and hide how deeply unpopular they are, something that we demonstrate by being in the streets, and something that matters really a lot in the United States because, quite literally, our Constitution outlines that the power of the government comes from the people. And if the people do not approve of the government, they have not only the right, but the duty to change that government. So they're trying to prevent that. Let me push on that a little bit further, though, and say that one of the things about Trump's declaration again that he's against mail in voting, as he was in the past, and then he wasn't, and now he is again. If you stop thinking about all of this as a play by play, he's doing this because his feet hurt, or he's doing this because he's mad at somebody in Congress or whatever. And you look at it as sort of a larger systemic system. If you have troops, even if they're not friendly to you, in the major Democratic cities at the time of an election, and you have gotten rid of mail in voting, so everybody needs to be at the polls on that day, what you are doing is you are enabling the administration to intimidate the voters so they don't show up, or so they are afraid to vote the way that they want to vote. And we know that. We know, and political scientists will tell you that even a single in interaction with a police officer, for example, decreases the chances that somebody will vote in an upcoming election. And it seems to me that that whole push is an attempt really to keep people away from the polls, to make sure that they are afraid to vote. And this is, we can point to places like Viktor Orban's Hungary or Vladimir Putin's Russia to see how this plays out. But you need to look no further than the United States of America during Reconstruction, when quite literally the former Confederates would hold gun rallies, shooting contests on the edge of political rallies of then it was the Republicans in the American South, which tended to be Black people and to some degree their white allies. And, what did that do? It meant that Republicans stopped showing up to vote. And then as soon as the Democrats controlled the American South, they took away the right of Black Americans and their white Republican allies to vote. So we've seen it before. And in such a weird way, Allison, I feel like we are just in so many ways reliving freaking Reconstruction. And I will emphasize that Reconstruction had wonderful, exciting pieces to it, too. We had new literature, we had new music, we had new voices, we had hundreds of Black newspapers all over the country. There were many aspects of the late 19th century that were truly American and truly exciting. But they were also times of lynching and the stripping of political rights from people of color, from immigrants, the attempt to consolidate wealth and power among a very few people. And I would sure rather skip this next part and go straight to the progressive era rather than seeming to go in the direction we are.
Yeah, and historically speaking, there always seems to be kind of some sort of catalyst that clues the electorate into the fact that there's a massive wealth gap and that there's a ruling class and oligarchs are taking over. And I think that right now, I think that that catalyst seems to be what, the mass deportation and the coming in and removing of our neighbors. And, you talk about the connections between what we're facing now and Reconstruction. And I always think of, and I think I brought this up during our conversation we had a few days ago, of Professor Jelani Cobb talking about the Fugitive Slave Act and how, the federal government was coming in and snatching people's neighbors out of their communities, and that really started to drive that resistance forward. And these weren't just abolitionists that were upset; these were folks who were upset that their communities were being upended. And so it didn't really matter what side of the political aisle you were on. And then this people started to see it as a top versus bottom and not left versus right. And, he said something that sticks with me to this day. And I think about it all the time when I think about the resistance now. He said the fundamental civic unit in our nation is neighbor. And once you start messing with that, things go very, very wrong for the ruling class. And you did a piece, I think it was yesterday, on the Chicano Revolution, and how your closing thoughts there are talking about people power and the power to vote, and that is the real revolution. That is that's a very strong revolution. And I wanted to kind of use that to pivot into discussions about upcoming elections and what we're going to see in our special elections now, what we have been seeing and what we're going to see in 2026. But have you seen, I know you do a lot of history research, have you seen sort of a common denominator, an underpinning, like a common thread of a catalyst that pushes people to see the top versus bottom as opposed to left versus right, and how that also mirrors Reconstruction in the time that we're living in right now?
I have, and I thank you for asking that because nobody has ever asked me that before. And of course, that's what I'm always looking for. I was very taken aback by what a major backlash there was to the shooting of the United Healthcare CEO in New York City at the end of last year, or the beginning of this. Like you, I've lost track of time. Because I don't. You must have followed how closely people watched that, and how it was a thing on TikTok where they had the shooter lionized as a saint. It struck me then that the stripping of health care from the American people in order to enrich the healthcare companies was a flashpoint like I did not see coming. That is, I'm usually looking for more kitchen table kind of issues, and obviously healthcare is a kitchen table issue, but there was something visceral about that that it really took me by surprise. So one of the things that I think is playing in an important way is the cuts to Medicaid and now Medicare in the budget reconciliation bill the Republicans smashed through in July and that Donald Trump signed into law on July 4th. Because the people are recognizing now, the way it was written, first of all, it was pushed through so hastily. There were a lot of errors in it. And the Republicans, I think, expected that it would not really hit people until 2026 when the cuts really took force. But what happened was that by getting rid of the tax credit for people who made between 100% and 400% of the poverty, federal poverty level, it took away their tax credit to enable them to buy health care on the ACA markets. And what that meant was that, hundreds of thousands of them per state are going to lose coverage or have to pay extraordinary amounts for it. But by removing the people who, I'm going to have to close my car door because we're back in a storm,
Oh,
and
no.
you might lose me. What that meant is that a lot of people who still need the insurance are losing out of the pools, those who are healthier. And so everybody's rates are going up. Now, just today, I saw that the administration is talking about using AI to decide who's Medicaid coverage, who's going to get certain kinds of Medicaid coverage. That's the exact system that United Healthcare used that created such an extraordinary backlash because they were essentially denying care to elderly people with the expectation or the apparent expectation that they would not live to contest those decisions. That seems to me to be absolutely volatile. The idea that you are really truly having death panels, but in this case, it's death panels of artificial intelligence run by those robber barons. I think that one's on fire.
Yeah, I actually put out on Blue Sky earlier this morning. I called these the AI death panels. And I know about this because they also want to employ this at the Department of Veterans Affairs for claim applications to get your health care if you've served in the military. And that is, as you said, the exact same um, kind of software that they used at United Health. And they want to expand that now to Medicare, Medicaid, and the Department of Veterans Affairs. And I think that will be another huge flashpoint for everyone. And I think that, talking about what like the elections that are coming up and the people power, you mentioned the people power, because I do think that we don't even have to listen to polls. We have solid proof now that people power is bigger than money power. We can think about the Wisconsin State Supreme Court election where Elon Musk came in and dropped $25 million and had $1 million a day lottery or whatever, which he's being sued now for, and that case is going forward. The people said no with their votes. We just saw, I think it was yesterday or Tuesday in Iowa, we were able to break the Republican supermajority in the Iowa State Senate with a 22-point flip, a 22-point swing in a district that Trump had won by 11 points. It happened in Iowa also in January. Now, Joni Ernst today is dropping out of the Senate race for Iowa. We had Florida 1 and Florida 6, which we didn't win, but we picked up at least 18 or 26 points or something, 32 points in one of those races, something pretty big, pretty significant. And we saw New York City, what's happening in New York City. So when we see this train, no pun intended, coming down the tracks of trying to scare us from going to the polls, whether it's in an off when it's in, special elections this year or in 2026 in the midterms, and the threat to mail-in voting because Donald Trump controls the post office. When we see that train coming, but on the other track we see the train coming of people power. How does this come to a head, and how do we overcome what they're going to try to do we've seen voter suppression since forever, but now it's on steroids because Donald Trump controls the levers of the federal government, although the states administer elections. What does that look like in our future elections?
So I think it's important that Trump is not in good shape. I really do think that's key, and we haven't mentioned the Epstein files, which are also terribly damaging to him. But I think that really matters because you're talking about elections in the future, and right now there's an awful lot of politicians or wannabe politicians who want to get elected to office or stay in office, and they're not at all sure that sticking with Donald Trump is the way to do that any longer. One of the reasons he managed to get the consolidation of power he did was because he could command his MAGAs to turn out and show up for him. And they are souring on him, both over Epstein and over the recent comment that he wants to have 600,000 Chinese students come to the United States. That, for MAGA, that is very xenophobic and anti-immigrant, that was just like anathema to them. So it's not clear if you are a politician that swings right, that grabbing hold of MAGA is going to be the way to go. And like you say, Joni Ernst has decided she will not run, in part back to that healthcare issue. We're all going to die is not a winning issue because right now you literally have a group of people, an unpopular group of people running our country who literally are threatening our lives, and not just through the kinds of things you and I were talking about, but by their attacks on the center research, through their attacks on science and so on. That's not a good message to go forward with. And you've seen JD Vance in the Midwest trying to say, let's talk about the good things in the budget reconciliation bill. And people are like, dude, this is not what we want to talk about right now because the reason I mention that is because voting in a year and a half is going to be important. But right now, speaking up, making sure that electeds or people who want out is going to be crucial. Representatives in Indiana, where Trump is putting enormous pressure on them to redistrict. Indiana doesn't really want to redistrict. The Republicans don't want to redistrict. They have control of the state. They don't want to rock any boats. If people in Indiana speak up and say, do not do this, that's going to go a long way in this really malleable, I think, moment where it's not clear that this administration has the power that it pretends to. And I think you can see that that is the case because if it was as powerful as it is trying to pretend, it wouldn't need to be throwing troops in the streets and threatening to take over ballot, over voting and the railroad stations and so on. So I think I see it playing out, the people power playing out in voting for sure, but voting is the end game. In the meantime, we need to be pressuring our electeds and wannabe electeds to do what we care about. And I thought it was interesting this morning. You can see, and we could go on at huge length about Susan Collins, a senator from Maine, but she has been very vocal about the attacks on the appropriations process. And today she came out and said what the administration is trying to do is unconstitutional. Well, it is. And they're badly intruding on her authority as the head of the Appropriations Committee in the Senate, which is a plum position she worked her whole life to get, and they're just pissing it away, basically. But it's also a reflection of the reality that she recognizes that here in the state of Maine, she's really under pressure from a number of candidates who are saying, we can do better than her just by embracing the idea of protecting healthcare. So those pressure points, making sure people step up, stand up, talk to people at the state level, at the local level, but also at the national level, is going to be crucial to turning this ship around. And again, that's exactly what happened in the 1890s when it looked like the robber barons had gotten everything. And within 12 years, from 1900 to 1912, in 1912, all three major candidates running for president were progressives.
Yeah, that's an important piece of history to remember, and I think, hopefully, we're well on our way. Heather, I really wanna thank you for joining me today. I encourage everybody, if you haven't already, to subscribe to Letters from an American. You can also subscribe to my Substack. It's called The Breakdown at MullerSheWrote.com. It's free to subscribe. You can get all sorts of interesting things there. I work very closely with a lot of current and former federal workers, really good people, patriots on the front lines, trying to push back and trying to resist the dismantling of our institutions and our government that works for the people. And so I would appreciate a follow there. And thanks for supporting independent journalism. And I hope that we get to have future discussions because I could talk to you for another 3 hours on a lot of a lot of these subjects.
Yeah, yeah, back at you, Allison, and I want to reiterate what you just said. Allison breaks a lot of stories that later get picked up by the traditional media as saying they are their stories, and they're not. One of the reasons I follow her as closely as I do is because you get the first stuff there, and it often is surprising, and it often shapes what we hear elsewhere. But I would also add that one of the things that I think, Allison, you and I and people like us are doing is creating a new kind of information web. And it's important for people to recognize that and to recognize that we all have specialties and that, supporting that web and participating in it is different and much more empowering than it is simply reading your national newspaper and saying, oh, that happened, that happened, that happened. We are much more about returning the power of the government to the people. So I'm proud to be doing this with you, and I thank you for what you do.
All right. Thanks so much. And, we'll be in touch and hopefully we can do this again. And thanks to everybody who's here listening. Really, you're participating in what Heather was just describing. So that in itself is an act of resistance. Thank you so much, Heather Cox Richardson.
Talk to you later.